I'm going to introduce our amazing speaker, Llewellyn Falco. Llewellyn Falco is an independent Agile coach. He discovered strong style pair programming. He's the creator of open source testing tool Approval Tests. He spends most of his time programming in Java and C#, specializing in improving legacy code. He's the co-founder of teachingkidsprogramming.org and co-author of Mob Programming Guidebook. Llewellyn Falco, thank you very much for being here with us. The stage is all yours.
Thank you. Welcome. How many of you have been to Craft before? Just show of hands. Quite a few. Nice. This is, I think, my 5th year at Craft. I really love this conference. And one of the things I love about this conference is we get to talk about the details of our work, which is not something we get at a lot of conferences. A lot of conferences, it's like high ideas, you get a lot of things about frameworks, but you don't get to get into that sort of like nuts and bolts of what we do. And so I think if most of the conferences I go to, if I gave a talk on documentation, I would be speaking to an empty room. And here I have a almost full room, which says more about you than it does about me. Thank you. There's a game I really like called Darkest Dungeon, and they have these little quotes, and this one sticks up to me a lot, which is, curious is the trap maker's art, his efficacy unwitnessed by his own eyes. It's an interesting thing when you do things and you don't get to see people appreciate it. And documentation does this in 2 ways, right? One is, it's very rare that no one ever says, oh, I'm so glad about this documentation, right? Like you never get the praise. But you also never get the negative feedback, right? It's very, very rare that you have like the equivalent of a usability test for your documentation. And so my first introduction to writing any documentation came after 15 years of being a programmer. I'd written an open source project called Approval Tests, and James Shore, a fantastic Agilist, was doing this series called Let's Play TDD. And he would do these live coding sessions and just sort of record them. This is back in like 2010, 2011. And one day, like episode 40 or something, he brought out Approval Tests. So I am sitting in my kitchen and I'm watching my iPad and I'm very excited, right? Like this is my product and he's going to use it. And it works so well for what he's trying to do. All he has to do is say approvals.verify. It's going to capture everything that his GUI is doing. Like he's been trying to test this for a couple episodes, not very well. I'm like, this is my time to shine. The project didn't have any documentation, but of course they had unit tests and stuff, right? Like it's not, you could have found it there. So anyhow, I'm watching on the iPad, and for 20 minutes, he cannot figure out how to type approvals.verify. It's the only method on the class, right? It turns out it's overloaded like 12 times, but it doesn't matter. He chooses any one of them, it works. Nothing. I'm screaming at the iPad, which does nothing. It's not like he can hear me. And at the end, he's like, screw this. And I was like, I never want to see that again. That was the first time I wrote documentation. It was not good documentation. There's a saying from Adventure Time, sucking at something is the first step in being pretty good at something. So I was at the sucking at something side. But I do a lot of pair programming. I do a lot of mob programming. If you're interested in that stuff, we'll do a session during the night. And the lady that I program C++ with is a lady named Claire McRae. She's out in Cambridge, England. We've never met, but we have spent quite a lot of time together pairing. I feel like we've become very close friends. And she cares about the users in just a way I've never seen a developer care. And because I'm pairing with her, I have learned to care about the users at like a fraction of what she does, but it's still considerably more than I used to. And I want to spend this session talking about that and talking about what I've learned about that. But I figure I'm probably talking to a lot of developers who might also not really care too much. So I wanted to stop by just putting this talk on pause. Oh, by the way, resources for the talk. I will show these now, but I will also show them at the end of the talk. Some people like getting everything up front. I'm one of those people who's like, I want to see what you're talking about before I decide if I care. So I will show you both times. But I want to put this talk to the side for a second and just talk about why I care about documentation at all. And then we'll come back to how to do documentation and how to do it easier and clearer, and maybe like some of the missing pieces there, and more importantly, I think, how to actually have it help you, right? Because when you write documentation for other people, it helps them. Very good, very noble. I'm a little more selfish, and so I want to give you some techniques that help you. So I mentioned Claire McRae. We have a technique called documentation as part of your definition of done. As I've worked with Claire, it takes me longer to do things with Claire than it does with any of the other people I pair with. And the reason is because the quality that comes out of our work is just so much higher. It turns out, like, if you do something really crappy, you can do it quicker, right? And as I worked with Claire, like, that's no longer part of it. And this documentation is part of the reason why. So I mentioned, like, I'm a developer. There we go. I started with the unit test is the documentation. And I want to start by just showing that that's not true. I'm going to show it in a very small, subtle way. But let's go take a look. Right. The first is, the unit tests show you how to use the code. The documentation, you would think, that's what shows you how to use the code. But it's actually not. The documentation shows you how to learn to use the code. And there's an interesting thing about that, which is, Dostoevsky has this saying, like, all happy families look the same, but all miserable families are miserable in their own unique way. I think of the unit test as like the expert user, the knowledgeable user. And all knowledgeable users are going to write the same code, right? But the beginner user is going to be confused in their unique ways, meaning there isn't a single beginner user, right? And that alone starts to change what you're writing. But I mentioned that the tests are not the documentation, and I wanted to highlight that gap. So here I have a unit test. You can see up here, right? We got our name, test. We got our numbers. We got our results. And then we check the results. Arrange, act, assert, just sort of a little intermingled. That's it without the extra comments. We'll talk about those comments in just a second. And this is the documentation that we wrote for this feature. I mentioned we write our documentation as part of writing each feature. And that's just because I think when you have just written something is the closest you are to like being fresh to it, being new to it. We'll talk about the importance of that later. But so here it says sort of like sometimes you wish you could add to an array the same way you add to a list. Here's some numbers. And then, hey, look, add to array, and we end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if it wasn't an array, you'd be like, yeah, no duh. Right? So isn't that the same thing that I did in my test? I mean, look, Here I've got my numbers, I add my numbers, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's a little bit of extra stuff, right? You can see this is like English pleasantries, right? They're words, they make the conversation make more sense, but they don't actually mean anything, right? Like I could delete all those words and the essence would be the same, right? You'd get the point. It'd just be ineloquent, right? All right, so that's not really the important part. I've also got these names, right? Like these are the key concepts. I've got add to an array with the added, right? But, oh, sorry, let me go back on that one for a second. You will notice that the actual name of the method is add to array. Add to an array, right? You're not really adding anything with that. But I've also got these code samples. Right? But those code samples are exactly the same as the code in my test. And in fact, if you remember those comments, they're exactly the same as they are in my test. They're actually coming from my tests. So all of that is in my tests. And the only thing that remains is this concept, the same way you can add to a list. That metaphor, that's a thing people know. People use lists. They add to them. And once you have that metaphor attaching that, hey, this thing is just like that thing, it's much easier to understand. And there's no way for me to really put that into the test. It's a small thing, right? Hey, this concept, it's very similar to a concept you already know. Let me tell you about it. But it's not there. So there is this gap, right? There are things that show up in the documentation that just don't show up in the code. And that's interesting. At least gives me a pause to say, maybe documentation has some value, even if it's small and for other people. But what about me? How does it help me? Well, the first way that it helped me is it started to help me write different tests. Having to explain things to a new person made me think about my own code in a different way. So here's the documentation for a project we do called Pipelines. Pipelines is a rather complicated project, but allows you to refactor synchronous code into asynchronous for definitions of asynchronous. And it allows you to do it in such a way that you can just do a pure refactoring and then at the last moment change one line and the whole thing becomes asynchronous. Very much not a refactoring, right? Like behavior can change. But a very useful project. So anyhow, we're writing about this. And we point out, like we have this nice little diagram here at the bottom. But we also point up here, like, look, you can write this one line as these 5 lines. Ooh, not the best sell, right? So we need this section here. Why would you do this? Why would you do this? Why in the world would you take something nice and simple and write it as something nice and complex, or maybe not so nice and complex? Right? But in writing this test, we had to write those code samples. I mentioned before that we're actually taking the code samples directly from our unit tests. And in writing the unit tests, the question is, I mean, I could just write those as code. It's always nice if your code samples compile. I've definitely use more than enough code samples that don't compile. But the interesting thing about these two things is they're equivalent. Later on at this conference, there'll be a whole session about property-based testing. Super interesting to me. But the equivalency property is one of the more common. The two most common are equivalency and inverse. And when we wrote the documentation is when we realized our entire purpose of this library is to enable refactoring. And by definition, refactoring means code A equals code B, which means everything in this library is property testable. And what that means very specifically, if we go to the code, is you'll see these two blocks. Up at the top is that one line of code, right? Like, hey, here's the simple version. And down at the bottom is the pipeline version. Ooh, all nice and complicated. And then down here is like what I would think of as a poor man's property test. Right? It's, let me just run all the numbers from 1 to 100 through it and make sure that they come out the same regardless of which way I do it. This should be obvious for us. It's a refactoring library. That should have been like one of the first tests we wrote. It didn't occur to us until we tried to explain it. So because we took the time to explain it to people trying to learn the library, we learned how to test our library better. And that's good if you care about testing. And I do. I care about unit testing a lot. But maybe you don't. So let's also talk about different code. The best thing you can get as a developer is your actual code is better because you wrote documentation. So here, we were trying to explain front-loaded reporters. It's a complicated edge case of approvals, usually written for CI machines, saying like, hey, when you're doing CI, you don't want to open up other programs that you would normally open on a machine. Hadn't documented it. Approval test is written in like 13 different languages, right? I mean, like the main ones, but also stuff like Swift and Lua and all the weird ones. I hadn't written about front-loaded reporters at all until I got to C++ with Claire. And the only reason we wrote this is because we had documentation as part of our definition of done. And front-loaded reporters were really hard to explain. And so I needed this mechanism down here. I needed something that was sort of an easier way to explain it. And so we made this machine blocking reporter because I couldn't explain the process. It was too complicated. I needed something smaller. But of course, because I use blocking reporters and we have documentation as our definition of done, and now we're making this new object called blocking reporters, which I'm only making because we need a way of explaining this other piece of code that I wrote. Now I have to write documentation for the blocking reporter. So we started to write documentation for the blocking reporter. And that's when we realized how powerful this piece of code was that we just wrote to explain the other piece of code. This piece of code went back to all the other language implementations because it's really, really useful. And I wouldn't have discovered it. I wouldn't have discovered that it was useful or even that it existed if I hadn't needed to explain this other piece of code that I never explained because it was just too complicated. And so now my library is better. That's the best win I can have. I have code that I am prouder of because I wrote documentation. And that goes to, sorry, let me skip over that. That goes to this concept, which is I have a lot of ego. And most of the time, that does not present in a, let's say, a positive way. But it does when I write documentation. Because while I will write some pretty crappy code, I will not document that I wrote crappy code. The moment that I have to start explaining why this code sucks, I will fix the code so I do not have to do that. And that has been the way it's helped my code the most. By just making me say, I don't want to have to explain why this sucks. Let me fix it. And when I'm sitting with my teams, that's the most common thing I see. Someone will say, like, hey, can you explain how to install this? And at the end of 19 bullet points, they're like, maybe we should just write an install script, right? And then that stuff is gone. So that's why. That's why documentation has been helpful for me. And I wanted to start with that because I think sometimes it's important to talk about the why. But it's not really what this talk is about. This talk is about the how. So I mentioned that a lot of projects, mine included, but definitely not mine alone, do not have good documentation. There's an interesting part of this, which is when James came to my open source project, fortunately on camera, he was definitely not the first person to come to my project and be frustrated. He was just the first person I got to see. He gives it some time. He gave it 15 minutes, which I think is generous because he was on camera being recorded. I think most people don't give a project 15 minutes. Maybe they give it 5. If it doesn't make sense to them, they leave. It's okay, there's other projects, you'll find something. But the interesting thing is most of us do not write open source projects. Most of us write code at companies where they pay us to write code. And maybe you're on a team at your company that writes, say, an API that other teams use. Or maybe you're on a team that uses an API that other teams at your company have written. Maybe you do both. When you need to use an API that your company has written, you do not get the option of saying, I'm not going to use it. Kind of forced. Your hands are tied. You've got to use the API. And that creates a very interesting desperation around code that's hard to understand, hard to learn. So why do you need to use an API that isn't well documented? And I think the obvious answer is obvious. I think the answer is obvious. Try that way. It's the lazy developers. Developers know how the code works. They wrote the code. They should be writing documentation, and they just don't. But there's a problem with this, and the problem looks a bit like this. Forgive me for reading a wall of text, but a newspaper is better than a magazine. A seashore is a better place than a street. At first, it is better to run than to walk. You may have to try several times, take some skill, but it is easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. Once successful, complications are minimal. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. Too many people doing the same thing can also cause problems. You need a lot of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock can serve as an anchor, but if things break loose from it, you will not get a second chance. So that, I think, is fairly insightful. Right? It's like a lot of insights about a hobby of mine. Maybe it's helpful for you. Successful documentation achieved? No? I should have maybe mentioned that I enjoy kites. They're a lot of fun to fly. They're pretty, they're nice. They're stunt kites that can do like amazing acrobatics. And of course, you can build your own kites. And after years of flying kites, I've learned that newspapers are better than a magazine. Seashore is a better place than the street. At first, it's better to run than to walk. You might have to try a couple times. It takes a little skill, but it is easy to learn, and even young children can enjoy it. Once successful, complications are minimal. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. Too many people doing the same thing can also cause problems. You need a lot of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. If things break loose from it, however, you will not get a second chance. I have written a lot of documentation that looks like the first version of this, that I think looks like the second version of this. It's so obvious, I can't imagine how anyone wouldn't get it. So if it's not those lazy developers, I think the only other option is the lazy users. They're the ones that know what they want. Why aren't they creating it? Be the change you want to be. The problem is, for good documentation, you need three things. You need to know what the good questions are. And if you know the product, you don't. Guaranteed, people with expert knowledge have no idea what beginners do not understand. It makes no sense. That is me yelling at the iPad at James. There's only one method. We don't get it. We can't see it. Once you know what the good question is, you need a knowledgeable answer. And guaranteed, if you know the good question, you don't know the knowledgeable answer. But how do I know if I wrote the first version of that documentation? In which case, I need feedback. The good questions come from people who don't know things. The knowledgeable answers come from people who do know things, and the feedback goes back to the people who don't know things. You need all three. That's what makes for good documentation. There's a site called Stack Overflow. Maybe you've heard of it. You will notice that it does all three of these things, right? They have good questions written by, who wrote that? Really small. Looks like a John, right? But John is not the person who answered the question on Stack Overflow. That was just the person who was confused. Timothy is the person with the knowledgeable answer. The person who asked the question, the person who wrote the page, is not the person who answers the question. But how do I know that Timothy's answer is any good? Because people vote on what the good answers are, and the good ones run to the top. In fact, how often do you even read the second answer on Stack Overflow? Oddly, I rarely read the question. Right? I normally jump, but if it wasn't for the person writing the question, that answer wouldn't exist. And if it wasn't for the feedback, I would not be reading the good one. Those are the three pieces. Those are the three pieces that you need to make good documentation. I'm going to talk at the end how to get these at your company. But before we do, I want to talk about crafting some good answers. Then we'll talk about how to put the pieces together. Does that make sense? So Daniela, he works in, I'm totally blanking. The Python, the Django, that's the word I'm looking for. Daniela works in Django, and he does a lot with their documentation there. And he's given some amazing talks on how to write documentation that is really good. I'm just going to sort of do a very small summary of his theory here. But I want to do it because for me it's been very, very helpful. So this is Daniela's theory of documentation. It is predicated on understanding your audience. I mentioned before that all happy families look the same. But when you're learning, not all learners are coming from the same place. And one of the things that can make documentation really, really hard is writing to the right level of a person who's trying to read the documentation. And since there's different people coming from different places, even figuring out what level you should be writing. Simon Kropp, who works in the .NET space, has a saying, it's like, if you do enough documentation, you always end up just explaining how to program, right? Like, that's not what you want. So Daniela separates the world into these four quadrants. We'll go through them in detail, but the basic titles are the tutorials, the how-tos, the explanations, and the reference. As I've learned to see this, it has made writing documentation much easier, and we'll just come over here into the real world for a second, and you will see that very often we just mirror explanations, how to, reference, tutorial. Nothing complicated. Make your 4 folders, put your documentation that references each one in each category. So tutorials. I think of this as like the hello world of whatever your system is, right? How do you get to just something? They're made for brand new people to your product. Meaning for absolute beginners. They are all about learning. Nobody who's trying to write a hello world is trying to do something complicated right now. They are trying to open the door and get started. And the thing you need to do is make sure that that door is opened and they walk through it. That means lots of hand-holding. Very, very detailed instructions. Platform-specific instructions. Checks. Here's how you know that you actually have the things you need. Very practical steps, and of course, code samples. Tutorials are often a little bit like typing classes. Type this, now type this. Maybe you've experienced workshops like that. They take a stupid long time to write. because they require that level of detail that the person knows if they do this, it will work. By the way, they are also essential to getting people to use your product, right? Everybody who comes to your product starts as a beginner. The moment that you're like, oh, I don't have to want to work with new people is the moment like your product starts dying, right? They are essential. They share two things with how-tos. And I will say Stack Overflow is almost exclusively how-tos. How-tos are not nearly as detailed as a tutorial. They assume you are already working in the product, that you have familiarity with the product. But you have a very specific thing that you are trying to do, and in doing it, you are confused. I have here, like, to make a salad, combine lettuce, tomatoes, cucumber dressing, right? Now you have a salad. But I'm not telling you how to chop lettuce or wash lettuce or chop tomatoes, dice tomatoes. I'm not telling you how to make dressing. Like, I'm assuming you have a fair amount of kitchen knowledge. Right? So you just might not know what the ingredients are. So very specific. And again, practical steps and code samples. They show up all the time. Reference. Reference shows up in a lot of different places. A lot of us, I think, came to documentation first through reference. Here's an API reference, right? Here's my classes that exist. Here are the functions that exist on them. Almost every language has those. I'm old, so when I started programming, we used to use these a lot. I heard stories of people who are even older who had these things called books, and they would look through the book to find like what was possible. But I grew up with like Java Doc, and we would just look at the online docs to do it. I don't do that very much anymore. And I think the reason is IntelliSense is now that version of reference, right? If you want the API reference, your IntelliSense usually gives it to you. But there's still this thing where it's like, oh, if I'm interested in this area, here are all the things. So I find that my reference usually has a lot of links. You're interested in executable queries, here's 5 pages that talk about them. You're interested in combinations, here's 3 pages that talk about them, right? Lots of links. Lots of theoretical knowledge. This is not a how to solve. This is a here's your entire menu. They also tend to try to be complete. I say try to be complete because I've yet to see any that are really complete, but that's the ideal. That's where we're trying to go. And then finally, the fourth quadrant is explanations. Explanations are a weird mix of theory and history. They have a lot of why answers. Why do we do things like this? Why do we no longer do things like this? Right? Why has this gone away? They are also theoretical, and they are also about learning. And this is the place where I see diagrams show up the most. This morning's keynote was an explanation talk. Notice all the boxes and arrows. Makes total sense. Like, that's what explanations are. And so you'll have noticed in each of these quadrants There were shared aspects. And that's one of the reasons documentation ends up being so tricky to write, right? Is this piece a how-to, or do you need a little tutorial to get them to the how-to, or maybe some reference in case they want to go farther than this particular problem? And the problem is, when you cross those borders, even though it is very, very tempting to do so, the moment you cross a border, the documentation becomes much harder to write and much harder to consume. Worse for you, worse for the end consumer. Which is all to say, stay in your quadrant. Configuration as code. Most of you are familiar with this term. It started showing up in the DevOps world, I don't know, like 2014, 2015. It's really nice. I really, really like configuration as code. Before that, because I've been using CI since like 2003, my first Mac Mini was really just an excuse to have a CI server in my house. So I was like, oh, I like the Mac Minis. We could get one of those, and we could use cruise control on it. But when we did stuff like that, this separation between writing the code and writing the CI caused a lot of pain. Right? What we do with CI now is very, very different. Right? And a big part of that is it's just now part of our repos. A term I have not heard as much of is documentation as code. But that has also started to become a thing. It started with the READMEs on the Git repos, and then it sort of just expanded until all of the documentation was straight in the Git repo. And so I want to take a small time to talk about Markdown snippets. A little free open source tool, definitely not the only one. There's the one that I have been using, I like it a lot. The important part of it is not the tooling. The important part is that your code samples are no longer just code written in a Markdown page. That's why so many of us have had the experience of copying and pasting code samples and having them not work. Which, by the way, is like the worst experience for someone who's trying to solve a problem, right? Like debugging code I don't understand to solve a problem I'm obviously not understanding. That's why I'm on your page. Not very helpful. So it basically has three parts. It has the snippet name. That goes in your Markdown. And then in your code, you have the comment, and it doesn't really matter what comments you use for which language, right? But here I'm using a C style. So you have the begin snippet and the name, and that basically says, hey, take this name and put it here. And then it has the end snippet, which lets you know where the code ends. I showed you in the very beginning, hey, I have this unit test, and I have this code, and I mentioned like, hey, it's coming from here. Here's our begin snippet with the name add to array. It ends here. Here's another snippet with the name add to array result, and it ends here. It takes it in and puts it in, but then it also does this thing down here where it shows the snippet source. I'm going to show this just sort of live again. Let's go to, so here I have some code. You'll notice down here we have the snippet source. If I click on that, it actually takes me directly to the code. And that does another thing, which is it gives context. So if you're like, wait a second, what libraries are they importing? Well, go up to the top and see the actual libraries, right? It's really annoying to put that in the documentation. It makes it hard to read the documentation. But it's really nice to have it when you're confused. So that the balancing act of, am I being too specific or too verbose? You don't have to make that anymore. Give the nice, clean piece of code, and if they need more, they get the full code. By the way, this also works really great with documentation as code. If we were to jump to the actions, we will see formatting and snippets over here, right? Which does two things at once, but I put them together in the same action, which is first, it formats. This is Python, so we're using the black formatter. It's highly opinionated. And then it creates the snippets and upgrades the documentation. This is interesting to me because this is CI that does not compile or execute my code in any way. That's a very different thing than CI 10 years ago. 10 years ago, CI compiled your code and ran your unit tests, right? Then in 8, 7 years ago, it would deploy for you. And then it started running it on lots of different platforms. Like if we look at the C++ version, and go here into our build. Look at all the different things we are testing, right? And look, hey, Mac messed up on us for Xcode. Check it out. But before, I would just run it on one flavor. Now it's so easy to create these matrices that we run our CI on tons of flavors. And then somewhere in 2019, sort of right before pandemic hit, this stuff started showing up, where it's all these other processes that are related to your project, but are not actually compiling or running code. And documentation is one of those things. So ND snippets is how I make my code samples. I'll refer to that as we go into actually writing a page. So I want to start by just walking through the actual steps of creating a how-to. We mentioned before how-tos are most of Stack Overflow. They are definitely not the most important parts of your documentation, but they are the easiest parts of your documentation to write. If this talk resonates with you and you go back and you do the exercise at the end with your teams and you start writing code or writing documentation, I highly suggest you start with a how-to page. Right? Get a couple of those under your belt before you try explanations or tutorials. Tutorials, again, I think are the hardest just because of the attention to detail that's required. But explanations are the ones that have just made me go blank. Where I'm like, I am really struggling to explain this concept. So, here's a sample from approval test. This is in Java. How do you encapsulate your database calls? Right. So, notice it starts with the word how to. All your how to pages should start with the word how to. That's not true for your reference or your explanations, but it's a very hard and fast rule for your how-tos. Step 1 of any how-to is exactly what you would do in Stack Overflow. You would describe the problem. The problem. Testing a function that both queries and persists changes to a database presents a considerable challenge, as it necessitates the presence of a live database to perform inner operations. How can I restructure the function to make it easier to test? That's the problem. If that's the problem you're trying to solve, you're in the right place. If it is not the problem you're trying to solve, you are in the wrong place. It's the whole point. Just letting people know, have I shown up to the right place? Next, I need something more concrete, right? So here's a scenario. In this scenario, we're going to deal with a function that processes a list of items for in-store pickup. The function reserves the desired items at the store until the customer arrives. Here's the sequence diagram. So I mentioned diagrams show up a lot in explanations, but they show up in other places too. And one of the things that's really nice about document as code is that a lot of places have started to adopt mermaid, right? So here's some mermaid. Maybe not as easy to read as one would like, but it will render like that. So easy to edit, easy to display. I'll zoom into that so you can actually see it. So here we have a sequence diagram. We come in from the code. We go over to the database requesting inventory. We come back with some items and quantities. And then for each one that exists, right, anyone that has a quantity greater than 0, we put the item on hold, and then we send back a confirmation. That's the sequence that we're trying to test. And hey, everything over here makes it difficult. So we have the problem, we have a scenario, right? So now we know for sure, like, what it is we're talking about. Well, now we know almost for sure what it is we're talking about. Next, you need an example. So here we have some code. Here's an example. We can start talking code now. You will notice it is a snippet. This particular snippet isn't really a test. It's in my test. It's in the unit test project. But it's just code that compiles. You would be surprised how just having code that compiles is a huge step up, even if you have not verified that it actually works. So we got the problem, we got the scenario, we got the starting example. Now we need the solution. Again, another snippet. And hey, refactor it to use the loaders and savers. Very specifically, we've created this inventory loader to abstract that out, encapsulate it, and this reserver, again, to extract it out and encapsulate it. Very simple encapsulation. So much of our world is solved with encapsulation. And now I just need to explain why that's a good idea. So I just took it to chat because it's pretty good at this stuff. So went to ChatGPT and said, please explain why this is better, and just pasted in the markdown. And it came back with this, which is a pretty good explanation. It's better than I would have done. So I just took it. So, problem, scenario, starting example, solution, the why. These pieces tend to be in every single documentation for how-tos. If you go over Stack Overflow, you'll see variations of all of this in both the question and the answer. It is the formulaic part of this that I think makes how-tos easier to write, which is why, again, I suggest you start with them. This one had an extra piece because the whole purpose of this was I want to separate it so I can test it easily. So now I need to show how to test it easily. Here's the final result of the test. Not every how-to would have this. It's kind of specific to this particular problem. But you can see here, let's go back. We can see here we have these items. We create a mock saver. We say we have this loader that tells us we have milk in the sold out item. This item is sold out. This item doesn't exist at the store, so the only thing that should get reserved is milk. And then at the very end, we say, hey, we only reserve the milk. And again, if you are curious about the missing pieces of this, they all show up, because again, we're in documentation as code. I thought I had a link to this, but easy enough to find. Go here to Java, click a T. There we are. All right, so as I mentioned, the mermaid gets rendered. Our snippets are inlined. And if you're confused, you can go to here. Takes you right into the code. Again, because we are in our repo, if I'm like, what is this mock saver? I can just click it and go to it and be like, oh, but wait a second, what are savers again? Oh, I'll just click it and go to it. That's a pretty simple interface. Like everything is there, right? It's not like in a separate place where it's like, well, I hope you get back to where the good stuff is, right? So that's our example test. Wait, before we move off of here, I do tend to take the entire thing when I'm done and run it through chat again, just because it tends to make things nicer. I highly suggest that. If you're writing English in general, give it to chat and just say, what improvements do you suggest? Most of the time on chat 4, I accept the suggestions. It seems to be a better writer than I am. All right. I want to talk about a documentation fest. I'm going to talk about this a little bit, and then I want to actually try it out with you. So we briefly mentioned at the beginning of this that I'm a technical coach. I do a style of coaching called salmon coaching, which is a style I invented, but that Emily Burke wrote a whole book up and sort of like turned into a thing, because Emily's all kinds of awesome. And the way that salmon style coaching works is you sit with teams for 2 hours a day for 2 weeks at a time, and we mob program together. And that tends to both form a cohesive team, but also allow the coach to like introduce behaviors that will continue once the coach leaves. But another part of salmon coaching is what's called a learning hour. And learning hours are sort of what craft is, except for craft is 2 days long, wonderful, but also exhausting, right? Learning hour is just 1 hour every day. Right? And I think of it like going to the gym. I mean, I don't actually go to the gym, but I've heard about other people who do. And what you find is the people who go to the gym every day are in really great shape, right? Because that seems to be what's required, is a little bit of exercise every day. And I have found that the same is true for learning. That like the way you really learn a lot isn't this big batch, right? I don't learn a lot at craft. What I get at craft is a whole bunch of things that I need to go back home and actually learn. Craft is where I learn what I need to learn, right? But the actual learning usually occurs later on. Learning hours are made like that for the company. So every day, all the teams get together and we do an hour. Sometimes we watch lectures. Sometimes we do exercises to actually like get it into our muscles. Sometimes we do the exercises over and over, so they're so into our fingers that we can do them while we're doing other things. So like I think of this as sometimes you're doing stuff about awareness, sometimes you're doing stuff about proficiency, sometimes you're doing stuff about fluency. All of it's important. I try to make a good mix. But it does mean you have to come up with a lot of learning hours, right? If you're doing one a day, it's like 20 a month. And then like on your 5th month, you're like, ooh, what am I going to teach today? And I wanted to do something on documentation. And I had talked about the theory of documentation. We actually watched Daniela's talk together. But I wanted to get something more hands-on. I wanted to get something where it's like, let's build some stuff together. Let's see what it's like to build this. And my rule for learning hour is usually a learning hour should be important, useful, practical to someone who does not work at the company I'm working at, right? If it's only useful because I'm not going to do a learning hour on like our architecture, that's just a meeting. I don't want a meeting. I want something where we're like really exercising. But on the other hand, when you're doing 60 learning hours in 60 days, you take shortcuts. And so I knew there was this one project that a lot of people were using, and they were very confused about. So I said, for today's learning hour, we are going to do a documentation experiment. And this is how I ran it. The first thing is I mentioned the project. This is what we're going to use. It was a calculation engine, right? And I said, you know, we had the person who wrote the project, right? So this was a single developer in charge of the whole calculation module. The other 60 developers at the company used this, and they were all kind of confused about it. To make things worse, the developer who wrote it was really smart. You think that would be an advantage, but it presents two particular types of problems. One, he's very comfortable with complexity that other people weren't. And two, a lot of times when he would give explanations, the other people wouldn't understand the explanations, but they felt too stupid to ask questions. So we introduced the project, and then I sort of put him on mute, and we just went to collecting titles of pages. I time boxed it, and we ended up with about 25 titles of documentation pages that people wish existed. That's a lot. My next step was to clarify. So we took all 25 and we put them into the quadrants, the 4 quadrants. Tutorial, explanation, reference, and how-tos. There was a sort of equal distribution around those, with the exception of tutorials. Usually there's only sort of 1 or 2 tutorials, right? It's a limited scope. But there's no way I was going to start with tutorials, right? But just classifying them was helpful. And it was helpful in a couple different ways. In the very beginning, there were things like how to set up a system. And like, oh, that sounds like a tutorial. No, it has how to in the name. Like, this is not a tutorial, right? There were tutorials, but there were other ones where when we looked at the title, we were like, this clearly belongs as an explanation. And the person's like, no, it belongs as a reference. And when we flushed it out, we realized this was actually 2 pages, right? And then we came up with 2 titles, one which now was clearly the reference and one was clearly the explanation. So there's that exercise of just categorizing it, and that brings a lot of clarity to what you're actually trying to say, because a title is short and not that detailed. Once we had done that, we were all sort of on the same page of which quadrant it belonged in, we then did a dot vote. Meaning I just sort of gave like 3 votes to every developer and said, what are the most important ones? It was overwhelming. The winner wasn't like slightly ahead. It was like 80% of the votes were on this one page. And I've done this a couple times at different companies, and it always seems to go that way, right? Like there's lots of different things that are annoying people, but there seems to always be one thing that's really annoying everybody. That's the place you start. Now, on this one, I actually limited them to the how-tos before they do it, but I find I don't need to do it. It always shows up in the how-tos anyways. It tends to just be a thing. So, just to summarize again, we collected all the titles of the pages. We categorized which quadrant they belong in. And then we voted on which one was the most painful. And then finally, we actually wrote the page. And if you remember from the very, very start of this talk, hours ago now, there's 3 things that you need. You need the people who can ask the questions. Those are all the titles we collected from the people who want to use this service. You need the person who knows, or people or person who knows the answer. That was the team that wrote it. In this case, the team was a single person, but usually it's a team. They're the people who can actually write the answers. And then you need that feedback that the answer actually makes sense to people. And the nice thing about doing this together is you have all 3 of those components. As they start to give an answer, people are like, that makes no sense. Or, in this case, and in many of the cases, because the thing that, the process that was written, the product that was written, the service that was written, was complicated, when you would ask for like, how do I get out of the door? They would not say the door is there. They'd be like, oh, well, in the case of a fire, we've got to, like, nobody cares, right? We don't know how to get out the door. We don't want the edge cases. We don't want all the detail of why this was actually complicated or why you've built something that's really robust. We're not ready for that yet. We will be at some point, hopefully in the future, but we aren't now. And because that's where the team lives every day, they tend to want to show that. They're proud of it. It's just not helpful yet. So having both people together, the team that can write the answer and the consumers that can say that answer is helpful or that answer is not helpful, is really important. Excuse me. All right. I want to do a really small version of this with you guys. But we have a problem, which is you don't work for the same company. So we're going to skip the second two steps. We're not going to do the voting and we're not going to do the writing. But I want you to go into small groups. I'm going to set a timer. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes for this. I want you to write the titles. So you might need to pick the projects at your company. What are the things that are currently confusing you? What pages of documentation do you wish existed? I want you to write those titles. And then when you've written them, I want you to share and classify them. Are they tutorials? Are they explanations? Are they how-tos? Are they reference? I will put that slide up. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do it. I'm going to ask you to just sort of form groups of about 5 to 7 people. Does that make sense? Have at it. I'll put the timer on the screen. All right, we are at time for the first one. Before we go into categorization, can I get a couple samples from the groups of like some of your page titles? Anyone from this group? What's the high level explanation? What category would that be for you? I'll give you a hint. It's in the name. There we go. Good. That's why we do categorization. In the back, can you give me one of your titles? Yep, and give me the title. How to spin up and start a provider? Off provider. Like open verification provider.
Would you be so kind as to repeat?
Yes. Oh, we have a microphone. So great. Thank you.
Yes, it'd be how to spin up a auth provider instance.
Nice.
And run local dev.
So what category would you put that under?
How to.
How to would work, yeah. I could see it with a slightly different title being a tutorial, but I don't know your product well enough to know that. Yeah, what do you got?
They're mostly how-tos.
Yeah.
How to onboard newcomers, right?
Nice.
Then one thing is flow of features in between test environments. So I guess that's more of an explanation.
How to do a test environment against a test model?
No, it's like how features move, say, from user testing or from feature testing
nice.
to
Oh, that's all
testing.
even like possibly process.
Yep. Yeah, so...
Right, absolutely. Right, like I always think of it in terms of API, but obviously there's much more to our company than just the API, right? And a lot of tacit stuff that if you write it down becomes really useful. This talk is not about that, but while we're on the subject, one thing that I've found is a very nice hack from Arlo Belshi is, let's say that you do have a process at your company. What was the process you were talking about? How to onboard, right? One little trick you can do with that is you can write down your list, right? Oh, here are the 10 steps that you need to do to onboard somebody. And then you can write, say, like a little Python script that says, do step 1, press any key when done. Do step 2, press any key when done. And now you have a script of your manual process, which doesn't sound like it would be that great. But then you'll be like, oh, you know what? Step 8, I could code that in. And now your 10-step process is actually a 9-step process. Actually, step 3, we could program that in too. And now your 10-step process is an 8-step process. And eventually your 10-step process becomes like a 1-step process. And that 1-step process is really annoying to program. But if you do it, it's a 0-step process. And now you've actually automated that process away. It's just a little hack to take a manual script and allow you to chip away at it until that process becomes fully automated. It's been really helpful for me. Use it as you will. Sorry, so we did that one. Let's do this group in the back. Give me one of your titles.
Let's say that we are working on a test automation framework,
Mm-hmm.
and the page would be how to create basic test case.
Nice. And
That
give me the
would be a
category.
tutorial, I think.
Nice. So tutorial, because that is your entry point.
Yes, the absolute basics.
So maybe a title would be like your first test case.
Yeah, perhaps.
Nice. All right. So continue in your groups. Share. Just go around in a circle. Share one title. Tell what category it's in. All right. I'm gonna give you another 5 minutes. All right. I'm gonna end you 1 minute early just because I wasn't paying proper attention to the time, and I want to give enough time at the end for questions if there are any. Really quick summary on this one. Step 1 is ideation. Get your teams together, ask for titles, right? This is not the point to judge. This is the point to just get stuff out. Step 2 is to categorize. That gets everybody on the same page. And then step 3, which we did not do today, is to vote. Which one is the most important to you? Now, I'm not going to have you vote because you don't work at the same company. But I did mention that the thing about craft is this is the place where I learn what I need to learn. If the thing you wrote down resonates with you, take it back to your company. Sit with the team and bring more than just you. Like when you show up and say, I don't understand stuff, right? Most of the time you get a go away. But when you show up with 5 people and say, we don't understand stuff, usually stuff gets fixed. Right? So go to the team and write that page with them. And by write that page with them, I mean you're giving them the title, and as they're writing it, you're saying, okay, that makes sense to me, or it doesn't. But they need that. You need to be there as they're writing it, or they don't understand that it doesn't make sense. They are writing the kite documentation. All right, so I skipped the 4th step. But that is the 4th step. Write it. Go home to your company, take the page you wish existed, and sit with the people who know how to write that page and get it written. If you do that, life will be better for you. And what's better than that? That is all I have for you today. You have stayed here for 2 whole sessions. Thank you so much.
Wow, man. Thank you so much for that. It's a lot of information. I'm sure that everybody has a lot to process and to bring home and to their companies. First, I want to give you a little gift.
Ooh, thank you.
If you open the first page, there will be a little picture of you. Yes, that's really nice.
So cool. Thank you so much.
No problem. It's our pleasure. Secondly, we have a few questions. We don't have that much time, but maybe we can answer a few of them. Like let's do the by order. Should the developer write the documentation, thus differing by person, or should an architect, tech writer do it so it's more unified?
So I like having it together for 2 reasons. Well, first of all, if they write it without the confused person in the room, it's useless. Like it doesn't matter. You've already lost the battle. But the architect, right, or a tech writer tends to be better at the big picture. Often they're wrong about the details. So I like having both people in the room, right? You're going to have better details if you have the actual programmers there, but they're going to be not as comprehensible.
Okay, second question. Is your salad how-to a good documentation? Smiley emoji. It is a very specific answer to a very broad topic.
Right, and how-tos tend to be that way, right? That's one of the reasons I really like the reference pages, right? Very often at the end of my how-tos, I will have, here's links back to if you're interested in other types of salads, go to the reference. And the reference will be like, here are the 7 types of salads you might be interested in, right? Maybe a better title for that page would have been how to make a garden salad, right? How-tos tend to be very specific problems. That's why they're useful. It's also why they're easier to write. If you stay in that quadrant, then link back to the reference page, that allows you to expand to the much bigger, more complex places.
All right, we have time for one more question. Does it make sense to have all of these different documentation for not public used codes, inter-team, company-wide?
Right. So I did mention doing this at a company during Learning Hour. And I mentioned before that, like, for public use things, if you don't write documentation, people just don't use your product. You don't get the option not to use the product if it's an internal thing. People are desperate. I have never seen people want pages of documentation more than when I do this for an internal company thing, right? Probably you have the same desperation for the things you have to use. The people who are using the things you write they will be hungry, they will be grateful. It just makes things better. Like, do it a couple times and you'll be surprised how much people really appreciate it and how nice it is to have people like using your product properly and happy about it. And these are people you're going to see more often. The open source world, we never get to see who uses our products. It all happens in a vacuum.
All right, actually, we can do one more.
Okay.
Any tips on keeping non-code documentation up to date? How do you prevent Confluence hell?
Yeah, don't use Confluence. That's my advice, right? This is what I meant by like documentation is code, right? Because it is. That's such, yeah. That's my advice. It's not like hopefully you can do that at your company, but like just put it in your repos, right? That's how you do it. Write your CI, whether you use MD snippets or any other tools. Use something that does keep your documentation like up to date. And one of the things I actually really like about MD snippets, or just the concept of your code samples come from your test, is that when you do change something that breaks something, you know about it right away, right? Whereas like Confluence could be broken for years, and how would you ever know, right? Who goes and reads Confluence pages for fun? Nobody does that.
All right. Can we do one more, maybe? Yeah?
You're in
Do you
charge
have a
of the
question?
time.
Oh, we have a question from the audience. Beautiful.
Yeah.
In your question?
Name is Marco from Erste. Where do you place in the spectrum of the 4X's business documentation?
Like documentation about process or documentation about like why you're building it? What do you mean by business documentation?
Business requirements.
Oh, okay, right. That's a different thing. So that's documentation on why you're building it. And I don't place it in either of those quadrants. That's not to say that we don't write stuff like that. Usually the stuff we write for that I find to be more temporary. What I usually do for that is we open up, usually still a markdown page, and we write stuff, and then we have a folder that's just called junk. And everything goes into the junk folder. Now, the rule is if it comes out of the junk folder, if we're using it again, it gets a proper name and gets put somewhere. But that's how we usually use it, yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for being here with us. Let's give him one more round of applause.